So this is a story about two daughters of faith. It is a story within a story, but the first story, we hear about a man named Jairus, and Jairus is the leader of a synagogue. We hear that this leader of a synagogue does something that is rather unusual for a leader of a synagogue. He humbles himself. He humbles himself to go and ask for help from this kind of lowly rabbi who's been developing somewhat of a reputation, and not necessarily the kind of reputation that a lot of the synagogue and temple leaders would like him to be developing, but nonetheless a reputation. But for one who is a leader of the synagogue, normally considered to be well-to-do and someone of high stature, to go and ask a favor of someone else was rather unusual. He must have exhausted pretty much most of the other alternatives prior to doing that. But see, he had something that was of greater value to him than his pride or his position, and that was his daughter and the love for his daughter. And so he went to Jesus and asked him to heal, and he asked him, and he asked him, and he asked him, and Jesus went. And so pretty much what we hear is he wasn't Jairus' first choice. He was further down the line, and Jesus went. If you would kindly open up your pew Bible to the Gospel of Mark, you will find one located somewhere pretty close to you, I have no doubt. Chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. Where we are in the Gospel of Mark at this time is Jesus has just expelled all of the demons that had possessed the demoniac from Gerasene, and he had put all those demons into a swineherd, and the swineherd had just dived off of the cliff and drowned. And after that exhausting experience, he gets in a boat and goes across the sea, and he comes on ground. And as always, Jesus doesn't get the afternoon off after a good day of work. He goes, and the crowd is immediately surrounding him. And the crowd around him always wants Jesus' attention and always wants something from Jesus, because the word about what he's doing is spreading to everyone around. And so the fact that Jairus would go up to him and want him for some help is not unusual. The fact that someone of his stature would go and ask probably was surprising to a bunch of people in the crowd, because they would not have expected Jairus, the synagogue leader, to ask anything of Jesus. But in verse 24 it said, and so he went with him. And I want us to pause for a moment and recognize that Jesus does that for us too. You know, we don't always remember to go first to God. Sometimes when we in our own lives encounter illness or tragedy or challenge or upset, we try to take care of those things with human means or other means, and forget that God probably should be the first person we go to. And often we're very good about remembering to pray for our friends when our friends have trouble, and are very willing to offer prayers for them when we are asked, but somehow, whether it's a matter of not feeling worthy or getting caught up in our own fear and confusion, sometimes we forget to ask for ourselves when we are in need. And so I would invite us to do that, but also to remember that whenever we ask, Jesus is always ready to respond and will do so. And so at this moment when Jesus is willing to turn his attention from the crowd to Jairus, follow him to go and take care of his sick child, something happens. There is this woman who really should not be in the crowd, because anyone who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years would be considered unclean in their society. It was very much a matter of the Levitical law that unclean persons shouldn't be traveling around amongst clean persons because that would cause ritual uncleanness. They certainly wouldn't be going to synagogue or temple, but they are often set aside as outcasts, put out of their faith community, as it were, and put sometimes aside out of their family. At that point in time, a person suffered not only the physical ailments of what was wrong with them, but then also suffered the emotional stress of being an outcast and the spiritual desolation of being outside of your faith community. I know for myself, when I'm sick, the thing I want most is to be able to come to God and to feel surrounded by the people that I trust to be my prayer warriors. And so this woman kind of risks a lot to be in this crowd. And she has it in her mind that if she goes and she just touches the bottom of his cloak, that she will be made well. And she does. And she immediately feels well. Her hemorrhage stops immediately. And can you imagine what that feels like? And I have to say, I just said those words out loud to you. And all week I kept saying to myself, no, I can't. Because, when I've had serious things happen to me, when I've been sick for a while, and sometimes I go and I have surgery, it takes a long time to heal. You just don't instantaneously become well. And so I cannot imagine when you go from this very sick state for a very long time and you keep getting worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden you recognize that you are healed, you are living again, you are whole. It's miraculous. And I'm sure she is stunned, and at that very moment, he feels the power go out of him. He feels this happen, and so he calls out, "Who touched my clothes?" It's a natural thing. And of course, his closest buddies, as always, what are you doing? Why are you asking? There's people pressing up all against you. How are you going to tell who's bumping into you? And, in a way, you'd say, why would Jesus do that? Because he's got to know that this puts her more at risk. Because she's not supposed to be in that crowd. She's supposed to be away from them all. And by calling her out, it would potentially cause her more shame. But he calls her out, and he looks around to see if he could recognize who it was. And she has the courage to go up and at his feet says, "It was me." And she explains why. And he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." That's on verse 34. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Up until that moment, she was the woman who was hemorrhaging. She had no name. She was classified according to her gender. She was the woman with the disease. And now she is daughter, member of his family, member of the community, part of the whole. She's not just restored in her body. She's restored in her mind, her emotional and thinking well-being. She's restored in her spirit. She gets to live again. She gets to be amongst her people. Her body's going to function better no matter, certainly, but all of a sudden the world is back to being hers again. He has named her daughter. And so, at this point, we really should be celebrating. It should be better than the 4th of July that went off in my neighborhood. And at this very moment when you want the hallelujahs to be coming and you want people to be shouting and everybody to be celebrating, what happens is the people from Jairus' house come and go, "Hey, Jairus, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's dead." And Jesus says, in line 36, do not fear, only believe. I'm sure Jairus' heart was in his mouth, and he had already stepped out of every comfort zone the man had ever lived in to go up to Jesus and ask for this favor. He had already had to be waylaid by this experience of the crowd pressing in, this woman touching him, and Jesus having this short exchange with her. And now he's heard that his daughter is dead. And Jesus turns to him and says, it's going to be okay. And he goes, and he's been asked to believe. And they go into the room, and Jesus takes her by the hand and invites this child. And he says the child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laugh at him. And in verse 41, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was about 12 years of age. The woman had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. At the point at which the woman's life was taking this nosedive towards death and dying, this child was born and she was coming into life. But then at the point at which they were both dying, they encountered Jesus. And they both risked. Jairus took the risk for his daughter. The woman, the second daughter, took the risk to ask for healing herself. And he touched them mind, body, and spirit and healed them. And we think that is just the coolest story we've heard. Isn't that great? What it would be to live 2,000 years ago and have him touch us. How we would desire to be then. But that's the same offer he gives to us. He asks us to risk. He asks us to be willing to risk that part of us that wants to always hold back when the parts of us are broken and hurting. When we are feeling racked with pain and racked with disease and racked with the ills of society, when we're suffering with addiction, when we're finding our lives falling apart from a loss of a job or divorce, when everything seems to be going in the wrong direction, he asks us to risk and believe and have faith. Now oftentimes the healing doesn't come in the way that it comes to those two women, but the healing that Christ always offers is to be coming into full life again. And that's a healing that is beyond this life here on earth. That's a healing that is full life into life eternal. When we have the faith that God offers us to have and encourages us and fortifies us to be able to have, then we can have the full life in Jesus that those women have. But it takes us risking and trusting and believing. And it's hard. It's hard when we're hurting. It's hard when we're afraid. It's hard when we don't know what the outcome will be. But we have a God who can do far more than we can imagine. We don't know what the end will look like, but what we know for sure is who is at the end of the tunnel, and it is the light of God. And so I invite us to risk asking for the touch of Christ in our lives, to open ourselves to the healing power of God each and every day, the healing power that is mind, body, and spirit, so that when we don't know where to turn, instead of turning to all those other places first, we turn to the one who can truly heal. May all the glory be to God. Amen.